on heading for financial extinction. It's how our financial system is not working for continued life on Earth. And now I'll pass you over to our host, Vince.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, and welcome to everyone who's on Zoom and on social media. It's great to have you here. My name is Vince, and I'm going to be your host. And this is one of many Money Talks Week that we've got going on, and it's being created by Extinction Rebellion and Urgewald. Today we've got another talk after this one called Boardroom Rebellion, which is all about how to sow the seeds of rebellion inside financial institutions. So make sure you check into that one. And this talk is called Heading for Financial Extinction. And we will be covering how the finance system works and currently what is going wrong with it with regards to our environment. And joining us today is Liam, who will introduce himself in a second. And don't forget that you can leave questions in the chat box at any time. So we're going to kick off. So Liam, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Vince. Lovely to be here today. So I got involved with Extinction Rebellion the end of 2018. I went to the bridge closures, the bridge blockades back in November of 2018. Didn't really get involved, but I went to a Heading for Extinction talk in February of 2019. And then a couple of weeks later, I was throwing blood outside Downing Street. And then, just kind of went from there, really. 2019 was just a, roller coaster year of being involved with Extinction Rebellion. And I was actually involved in bringing the skateboard ramp onto Waterloo Bridge, which was quite a serendipitous moment when we were talking the other day, because that was, it was quite a big thing for you, and how Waterloo Bridge was quite an important moment for you last year, and get involved with Extinction Rebellion yourself.
Yes, definitely. It's a funny coincidence. I'm going to try and share my screen and show the picture of the skate ramp that we're talking about. This is skate ramp on Waterloo Bridge. And this was a pivotal moment for me because I've spent the last 10 years of my life working in the finance industry. I've been working in sort of the kind of responsible, ethical end of the finance industry. I thought I was, doing my bit, I was doing a good thing, until one day I unfortunately took my lunch break, walked across Waterloo Bridge, and discovered there was a protest going on. At that time, I didn't necessarily have the most time for protesters, so I sort of brushed it aside. But I found myself wanting to go back the next day, and got talking to some people, and basically, very quickly, my kind of idea of what was the right thing to do very much kind of unraveled. And I find myself here now, almost a year later, doing a webinar titled Heading for Financial Extinction, which is definitely not where I would have expected, and definitely wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Liam putting that skate ramp up on Waterloo Bridge.
Yeah, it's absolutely, when you told me that, it was like just such a powerful example of and the argument for like being there and disrupting the public in the way that we did back in April. And your kind of story of how that deeply affected you was such a great example of holding out that kind of theory that we were disrupting people in their own city, because we were kind of trying to make this argument that actually this problem actually involved them, that it wasn't activists doing something to some other people, that it actively affected them. And I suppose this session today, really we wanted sort of to help me. I've been thinking a lot, I suppose, as we all have over the last sort of few weeks and months, about the financial system and how the current crisis that we're going through is also connected to the climate crisis. And I suppose this session is about how the finance system in particular is heavily involved with you know, both of those crises, and I suppose you're going to help us understand a little bit more about that today.
I'm going to do my best. No, go on.
Yeah. So I suppose maybe we'll go through, and I suppose just try and help me as just an ordinary citizen. So, you know, I'm just a normal person. I'm an electrician, go to work every day, and just want to find out a little bit more about how the finance, you know, what is it? So what is the financial system, and what is its purpose, really?
And yeah, so I think before we go into that, I just wanted to say that I think, you know, we got this whole week of finance related webinars coming on XR TV, and I think it's incredibly important. And I think at the end of the day, my experience has been, you know, I had the benefit of, you know, for better or worse, sort of selling my soul to the finance system for 10 years. And what that did give me was a lot of knowledge and understanding of how it works. So then when I've come on the inside within XR, you know, it's much clearer to me, you know, where we can have an impact. But I think for a lot of people, the finance system is very complex and very opaque, and it sort of hides behind a lot of that complexity. So we're going to try and do our best to explain it. We won't go into a massive amount of detail, but we're really just setting the stage here for what's going to come for the next week. So I think the first question that we often actually skip out is just, what is the finance system? And I'm gonna share my screen, which is going to explain to you how I see it. So I think the first thing to understand when we talk about finance is, like, what's the difference between finance and economics? We often talk about those things in the same breath. And I think the main distinction here is when we talk about economic policy, we're talking about things that are set by the government, you know, setting the rules of the game for the economy, right? That's things like regulation, tax, interest rates, subsidies, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's public investment that the government does. That's investment into things like the NHS or anything that, you know, that the government owns. But the financial system is specifically the allocation of investments and the movement of capital in the privately owned part of the economy. And it's an important distinction, because when we think about, let's say, like things like targeting carbon neutrality by 2025, we very much like focus on the government, because we say, okay, the government should be delivering on that outcome for us. But in reality, actually, a lot of the work to make that happen would actually have to happen within the financial system, because the government doesn't own the electricity network in the UK. It's owned by a bunch of companies. And so the decisions on, you know, in any given year, how much renewables versus how much fossil fuels in terms of the energy supply get built, that's made by investors who are making decisions on where to invest into companies. And, you know, similar with all sorts of things like, you know, how quickly the vehicle fleet electrifies. And so what this means is that, you know, financial system is incredibly important in influencing what really happens in the real world around us. And to my mind, this whenever we think about the financial system, we always have to keep in mind that it's basically serving two purposes or two responsibilities. One is it has its purpose for savers. So anyone who's saved money, they put it in their pension, or they personally invest it, or whatever, you know, they want to see their savings grow. And investing capital that has been saved is one of the main functions of the financial system. And we'll talk about that responsibility later. But the other responsibility is to society, is to invest and create an economy that we actually want to live in. And I think that responsibility has really been left behind. And, you know, the financial system kind of sees themselves as quite separate often from the outcomes. So that is broadly sort of the role of the financial system and where it sits in our broader kind of economic questions.
And we're going to talk a little bit, like you say, a little bit more about where the responsibility lies in a little bit more detail. So I suppose the next question is, what role is finance playing in the climate crisis, and also the social crisis that we've been experiencing with COVID-19 over the last few weeks and months? What role is finance playing in those crises?
It's I mean, well, the answer that everyone knows is it's playing an absolutely massive role. What I'm going to do is try and show you a few charts just to kind of like capture the stakes for the financial system, and also a little bit of the madness. So the first thing we've a lot of us will be familiar with these sort of emissions pathways, but I don't think we should ever kind of, we're in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, but it's important not to forget that we're in the middle of a much deeper, much longer, and ultimately much more destructive crisis, which is climate crisis. And so we have this very radical shift that we need to make as a society. And we're still going to have to make it after coronavirus. We'll have this, short-term dip in emissions, but the problem isn't going away. And so, as we said before, it's actually investment in the financial sector that really determines, our pathway on this. Governments will have an influence, but finance has to make the decisions and move the money. And as part of this, we know that we can't burn all of the fossil fuels that we've got available. So there's this concept called the carbon bubble, which is basically where we now know that we just can't burn all of the fossil fuels that are currently in the ground. Now, a lot of those fossil fuels are owned by companies right now. So we're in a situation where we've got companies that have these assets, all these oil and gas reserves that if humanity is to survive, cannot be extracted. These are called stranded assets. So we got a situation where, and the question comes like, well, why would anyone want to invest in these oil and gas companies then if a big portion of their investments are not worth anything in the long run? But then, even with that, with the knowledge of both the climate crisis and the very sort of basic financial idea that we have this carbon bubble, we find that the finance industry is still pouring billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year into oil and gas, and actually way more than into renewables. Now, I've taken these numbers. These are like pre-coronavirus numbers. Things will have changed, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that with the financial system, this is the course it was on, and when we get out of the crisis, it will do everything to return to that business as usual. So we've got to be really active in challenging it.
And what you were saying before, what we're trying to sort of get across, I suppose, is the insanity that's kind of inherent in the financial system at the moment, and has been for quite a while. And you said earlier that the financial system has a responsibility to savers and society, but if it's almost insane on both of those fronts, because savers are not going to get a return on their investments either through the climate crisis because of the destruction of the planet, and also the responsibility is also being discarded because obviously they're investing in things that are destroying us. So on both those fronts, they're kind of not really fulfilling their obligations, it seems to me. Yeah.
It's funny. I a couple days after I first got into the sort of the true reality, I really started taking in kind of emotionally what's going on with climate. I actually woke up a few days in the morning in a cold sweat. And I was like, oh my God, all the investments aren't worth what they're supposed to be worth. Yeah. And then, I spent months talking to peers in my industry and saying, well, okay, how do you feel about climate? What is it? What does it, how does it affect how you think about investing? And it's really amazing how many people who are like really smart, really clever people, they just kind of didn't want to deal with it. It's very strange. It's basically, I think, the psychology of denial. And it's really, it really affects the way that the investments happen, because ultimately financial market is all psychology. People invest in what they perceive to have value. So as long as the individuals that are making all these decisions are in denial, it won't work. And then obviously there's just such massive vested interests that are trying to obviously keep the system the way it is.
So on how the financial system affects individuals, I suppose, as well. Like, I mean, as an individual, you know, like I'm a self-employed electrician. 3 weeks ago, nearly, I was pretty much told that I couldn't go to work and I couldn't earn any money, and I didn't have an income. I was told that, you know, by the banks and stuff that I had loans and credit cards with, that basically not to get in touch with them because they were going to be so busy, and that they were coming up with plans to basically help people, etc., etc. So I didn't get in touch with. I took a loan out a few years ago to do like a training course, and I'm still paying it back. So I didn't get in touch with the bank. And then after about 10 days, I got an email from them saying that they were cancelling like overdraft payments. But you know, I didn't get any information about credit card or loan repayments. So a few days ago, I had to actually phone the bank up because my payment for my loan was due to go out on the 20th of March, which is today actually. And I think I phoned up on the 15th of March. And basically, when I rang the bank up, they said because I was within 7 days of the payment going out, which was the 20th, that I could no longer defer that payment. So that payment of £250 had to go out, and the payment holiday on the loans and the credit card, etc., could only happen for the 3 months after that. So, I mean, you know, I'm in a position where I haven't got much money. I don't know when I'm going to be able to go back to work again. And the bank still thinks that it's acceptable to kind of take the last sort of like remaining money out of my account. You know, and it just felt, you know, really deeply unfair. And I think lots of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are having this same problem with different financial institutions up and down the country. Yeah, so it kind of like highlighted how unfair the system is at the moment with regards to the COVID crisis, and what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really difficult position to be in, and I think it's, you know, it's hard because like when you're on the side of the, you know, the kind of the financial institution, you work in finance, you deal with all these investments and you sort of see it as like numbers on a page, and it just becomes like a job. But then it's like when you have an experience like this, it's very clear that it's like there's people on the other side of that, and something's going wrong in the system where it's somehow like too easy to just like, I guess, like dehumanize people, to just be like, oh well, you know, you came up on the spreadsheet and you've got to pay. So yeah, I think there's a problem with it. It's not designed really to take into account like people and their very kind of human needs.
And I suppose to talk about it almost seems like the system's kind of addicted to growth and debt. And when we get like a crisis like we're experiencing at the moment with the COVID crisis, where we almost need to, it's like in this sense of like having some justice, it almost requires like a pause on like all debt, you know, and in debt, and we're seeing rent people being charged. I saw, for instance, the other day, like a pub landlord has been billed £8,000 for rent from his pub, which had been shut down from the government for the last month, but the brewery is still charging the landlord £8,000 rent. There's kind of like this idea that the whole system is kind of like addicted to growth and debt, and the whole system kind of runs on that. And this is it. The COVID crisis is showing that up, but that's also true with regards to the climate crisis. It's addicted to growth and debt, and that's causing problems to our environment and our planet. These two problems are linked. There's like a subtle link in there, I suppose, isn't there?
Yeah, no. I think it's increasingly not a subtle link.
Yeah.
No, but I think I think it's a really good point, because I think basically what you're doing is like you're questioning this like basic assumption that we have, which is that like if I'm a landlord and I've got a tenant, I have a right to take my rent from that tenant no matter what. Or if I'm a bank and I've got a debt, I've got a right to take that debt no matter what. And I think we're in a really interesting moment now where it's like that's all being questioned. Yeah, and I think you're also really this idea of like being addicted to growth and debt. It's really interesting when you look throughout the financial system. You see how at every point in the system, it's like a machine which has been turned up to the absolute maximum it can, and so everything's running on these like really thin, fine margins of like to basically grow as quickly as you can, and the way that you grow is you take on investment, you borrow. But then what that does is it's kind of like if you're buying a house or something, the more you borrow, the more you're at risk of if the situation gets worse, that you're going to be in a bad situation. And I think that's what we're seeing now is we're seeing how we've got an economy where so many companies are so burdened with debt that as soon as there's a downturn, they're immediately going bankrupt, and then coming to the taxpayer to say, "Or can we have money?" But there's almost like it's almost like this was gonna happen. It's not like a surprise, right? Like there are things that go wrong in the economy. There are going to be crises, and so the fact that our financial system allowed us to get into a place where we were so unprepared is really criminal. And then we are all gonna have to pay for it.
It's like interesting that idea, criminal, and it just, I think crisis like this, it really shows up the heartlessness as well of the society, the lack of like any kind of compassion, and I think that's really going to be highlighted, especially over the next few weeks and months, definitely. So we've talked about the financial system, and we talked briefly about the responsibilities that it has. Where specifically does when people talk about the financial industry, it often feels very opaque, like there's no, it just feels like it's very corporatist, and it feels like you can't really get into it in any way. So where does the responsibility actually lie, do you think?
Yeah, so I personally think this is one of the most important questions that never gets asked. Which is
thank you very much.
Really, yeah.
He told me to say that.
And it's really important because you can't engage in something, you can't hold it to account if you can't see it for what it really is. So what I'm going to try and do is explain the financial system in one diagram, and let's see how it goes. Okay, so this is a financial system, and I've broken it up into the main elements. And the reason I've done this is because it will explain the places where actually the real power lies. So I think the best analogy almost for it is almost like a river, right? That's flowing from the mountain where there's a source, and it goes and it ends up in the sea. And it's very much like a flow of water. So what you have on the left-hand side, you've got what are called asset owners. So these are the institutions and the individuals that ultimately hold the wealth. They're ultimately the people that actually sort of own the money, so to speak. And there's three types of institutions that do that. The biggest is pension funds. Then there's insurance companies, which have quite a lot of money that they just keep because they keep your insurance premiums, and then they invest it because they're going to have to pay out sometime in the future, maybe. And then there's very wealthy individuals who also take part in the system. And these institutions, they've got money, and their job is to basically grow that savings part in the long run. Pension funds got to do that because they want to pay out pension contributions over 50, 100 years. So this is where it all starts. But then what they need to take that money and they need to invest it into companies, basically. And that's what we call the real economy. So that's actual businesses, that's infrastructure, that's anything sort of that's actually doing something. So these investors, they want to get the money into the real economy. But what's happened especially in the last 30 years is we've seen a massive growth in this bit in the middle, which is the asset management industry. So this is going to be companies like BlackRock that you've heard of, or Vanguard, or Hargreaves Lansdown in the UK. So what these companies do is they actually act as like middlemen. They just move the money for the asset owners, and then there's also banks, and it gets very convoluted because the banks are actually ultimately owned by the asset owners and the asset managers, which are the shareholders in the banks. And why this is important is because basically, it's really diffuse. There's a lot of individual decision makers. It's not like government where you've got the prime minister. It's really obvious who to hold to account. But if you do want to understand where the power is, you need to follow the money. And the money starts right at the top of the channel in these pension funds and other asset owners. And so these people, they actually have the power to determine what happens in the rest of the system. And part of the problem is, I think we spend a lot of time focusing on the really high profile companies, like, for example, the BlackRocks of the world. But actually, these guys are the source of the problem, and not necessarily the solution, because what they operate a bit like Tesco and Sainsbury's, where they're just middlemen. They're just trying to basically fill the shelves up, and basically they're competing with each other to do the financial equivalent of selling a pint of milk for the lowest price. So all they do is basically just try and make these investment products and sell them. And the competition between them is a lot of what's driven the short-termism in the financial industry right now, because they're all competing to show that they can give the most profits just to attract more money. So we've got this situation where we've got these asset owners at the top. We've got all this ultimately power in the industry, but they're not in the limelight. They're very, when's the last time you heard a protest at a pension company? there aren't a lot of them. And ultimately, they're investing our money, right? So we're in this perverse situation where pension funds are investing everyone's money in an economy that is going to destroy the world that they live in, and is wreaking all sorts of damage to our society. So that's sort of in a broad sense of how the industry works. But then the other thing I'll point out is that actually each of these institutions, there are people responsible within them. So most financial institutions have a board of directors of about 10 people, who look something like this. They're good people. They've got kids, grandchildren. They want them to have a good world to live in. And there's actually, if you think about it, probably a couple hundred companies that control most of the money in the UK, and there's only around 10 directors for each one. So there's actually not that many people, if you can find them, who are actually making the decisions in this system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If anyone on the social media, who's watching, would like to ask Vince a question, if you just put it into the chat, then somebody will get it over to Vince, and hopefully he'll be able to ask it for you. Yeah, so just if you put it into the chat, hopefully somebody will be able to ask it for you. So that's quite interesting process there when you're talking about the responsibility. So an interesting thing that was coming up last year was this idea of pension funds, and a lot of the councils up and down the UK were getting into trouble because their pension funds were investing in oil companies, fossil fuel heavy industries, and they were getting in trouble, and there was pressure on them to divest their investments from fossil fuel heavy kind of investments. But kind of, I suppose, what we've seen over the last kind of like 30, 40 years is a real depoliticization of money. We've kind of like freed the markets, this kind of neoliberal policies that we've seen kind of like all over the world really for the past 30, 40 years, which is kind of like basically summed up by privatization, deregulation, and kind of cuts in social spending, and it's been kind of fueled by this idea of like depoliticizing money, that we should let the markets kind of like do their work for us, kind of thing. What I suppose what I wanted to ask is, first of all, how does that affect us, which I think you've spoken about already in some ways. How does that affect us, and why does that matter, and how should maybe we try and change that?
It's fascinating, and when we were preparing this, I remember you put this question in about like, okay, well, what about the kind of politicization of the financial sector, and it just reminded me how much when you're inside the system, you really you really get trained to think that there's nothing to question here, right? We all just get to do we all just do our job, and as long as everyone plays by the rules as a financial system, then we don't have any responsibility for the outcome. And I think that's really toxic and really dangerous, because ultimately what will happen then is the financial system will just run on. And with each person individually doing what they think is the right thing, we'll end up in a terrible outcome just because of the way it's structured. So I think one of the most powerful things that XR can do is to like raise this question of well, actually, what should the financial system look like? What economy do we want? And not just assuming that we're going to have the same, growth focused, high debt, low democracy kind of economic system that we have basically been kind of stuck with pretty much since like the 80s.
Have we got some questions from some of the social media? Have we got any other questions there?
Yeah, we've got some questions coming in here. We got a question here, which is, how do we mitigate power by a more ethical management of financial resources? I quite like that. That's quite a good question. Yeah. Have you got any thoughts?
No, go on, Vince. You're the man.
I'm the man. Okay.
To hear what I've got to say.
I think this is. I think XR's thing around citizens' assemblies is actually really important here, because basically what we got right now is a system where the people that have to people that make the financial decisions are so far away from the place where the outcomes of those decisions are happening, and there's nothing, there's no structures or nothing that forces them to do that. So I think something that could be really cool would be making it so that every financial institution had to hold an assembly with everyone that was affected by their investments, right? So that could be like, the customers, that could be the employees, it could be communities in the places that are affected by it. And if they just had to like hear those people before they made the decisions, I think you would have it would really change things. Okay, I'm gonna take we got an incendiary one. So this person says, who cares about returns to savers? They are by definition the 1%, the capital owner class.
Yeah, I mean, I think, traditionally, like somebody like in my my grandmother and granddad, they you know, they worked for 30, 40 years and they saved. I think the like I was saying, I think that neoliberal kind of like system over the last 20, 30, 40 years has like really affected like people's ability to save anymore. But yeah, I kind of, I think the idea of saving is a good idea. I think it'd be nice if we could save more, but yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting point. I don't know how many people, what the percentage of people are that are savers in the UK anymore. I think it's pretty small these days. Is it not?
Yeah, I don't know the statistics. I mean, I think it's an interesting point, because I think we do have a situation where we definitely like have like the haves and the have-nots, and that's like, you know, greater than it ever has been, and the relationship between the two is increasingly toxic and strained, as we're seeing right now. But I think for me, my like hope, and I've always liked this sort of XR principle, like no blaming and shaming, even though it's sometimes really hard. Like, is there a way that we can kind of get through this without like needing a kind of like a sort of a bloody overthrowing, and that, like, you know, everyone can see their part in it, and I think that includes people with who have money. They've got a part to play in this, I think. All right, I've got another question here. So I think a really good question. How is someone who relies on their job and needs money to provide for a family meant to rebel against an economic system that provides so much for us?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry, Vince.
It was. How is someone who relies on their job and needs money to provide for a family meant to rebel against the economic system that provides so much for us?
Yeah, I mean, this is like a really interesting question. I mean, even like somebody like myself, who's like, I mean, I go to work, but I mean, I'm single, no kids, and even myself, I've faced that battle, you know, between providing for myself and looking after myself and being responsible, and having this idea of like going into activism. So I think, so one of the ideas that, I mean, I think in Money Talks Week, we're going to talk a lot more about what XR can and cannot do with regards to like activism, I suppose, within this industry. But one of the kind of ideas that I've been thinking about is, so within the debt strike is, there's quite an interesting campaign going on at the moment to target Amazon, where they're trying to get people to cancel their Amazon Prime account. But basically the idea is that nobody cancels it until you have 1 million people signed up to the campaign. So you know, you don't cancel until then. And I think this idea, it seems like a mountain, and it seems like fantastical in a way, but you know, sometimes in activism we have to have that idea of the practical is irrelevant, we just need to do it because it's right. Is that, you know, with regards to debt, maybe you know, you get that you're going to default on your debts, that you're prepared to do it, but you're not going to do it until maybe 100,000 people or 200,000 people or maybe 500,000 people, we all agree to do it at the same time, and that there's like a collective safety net through doing that. And we cause a real hammer blow to the financial industry if we can kind of do that, if we can kind of unify and come together in some way before we do it. I don't know what you think about that, Vince.
Yeah, right. It's this idea of conditional commitments, isn't it?
Yeah.
You sign up, but you don't actually have to do it until a certain number of people who do it. Yeah, I think that stuff is really interesting, and it's, I think, given the situation a lot of people in, it's going to be a much bigger issue. And the same thing is also happening with rent strikes as well. All around the world, there's people saying, well, okay, we're not going to pay our rent. So yeah, I think that there can be ways that like the rebellion, you know, can hopefully, for people who are in a situation where they are financially strained, that it might be of some benefit. All right, we got another good question here. There is no such thing as caring capitalism. It's not a question of ethics or bad or good people, but the bottom line, which is shareholder return. So what do you think about this? There's no such thing as caring capitalism.
I think for me, like, as I say, I'm not an expert. I'm just somebody who is living in this system and trying their best to survive in it at times and trying to change it as best I can. So I don't always know the answers to those questions, but yeah, it seems to me like this is kind of like I don't always know how to explain it, but it's like, I think this kind of like the ingenuity of human beings is one of our kind of greatest assets as well. And this idea of like, you know, that our entrepreneurial kind of like tendencies and the way we can create and be smart, it kind of in some ways seems like inherent in our nature, and it feels like that is kind of like a quality that we should kind of like not completely try to discard, and that is definitely something that involves like capitalism, I suppose, in some sense. But I do think that yeah, I think we've been confused into thinking that this kind of like idea of like heartless capitalism, this yeah, this idea of the rich get richer, and we forget about the more vulnerable parts of our society. Is that's definitely something that we need to completely revolutionize and change. And I think that is it's that attitude that needs to go for me. But I still think that there's parts to play in yeah, some kind of capitalist system in some way, but it needs to be much fairer to the vulnerable in our society, for me anyway.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think for me, this is where it gets really hard, because, you know, I spent years working with people who, you know, the financial system does help the world go around, and it enables so many of the things that we sort of, you know, are our basic day to day. And the people who are involved in it, like, I know them personally, they're not bad people, most of them. You know, there's a few kind of Wolf of Wall Street types, but like most of them are actually all right, and they're just sort of, you know, doing what they thought would be a good job. But I think that people have been really disconnected from the impacts of what they're having. So I think the financial system actually needs XR as much as XR needs a financial system, because I think we need to be brought back into connection to the kind of impact of what we're doing.
So we've got about 2 minutes left now. I think we need to start maybe thinking about wrapping up. It's gone so quickly, isn't it? It's been really great.
Yeah, definitely. So have you got any final thoughts?
No, I think it's just been really interesting chatting to you and getting to know you over the last sort of few weeks, Vince. And yeah, just going to tune into some of the other programs in Money Talks and find out more about how XR as a movement can try to actively kind of change the system that we're living in. So yeah.
Yeah, no, same. I really appreciate it. It's been so interesting, and thanks for building that skate ramp on Waterloo Bridge.
Yeah, pleasure.
So thanks everyone for joining us. So just to let you know that we have got one more session today. It's called Boardroom Rebellion, and it's 6:30, and it's going to be really interesting. It's all about getting inside financial institutions and influencing them from the inside. Some very cool people speaking on that. And if you want to know what's going on later in the week, go to the Extinction Rebellion homepage, click on the Alone Together banner, and then halfway down the page is a big link for Reset TV, where you can find out everything that's going on. So that's it from us, and thank you very much. Have a good rest of your evening.